Hello, and welcome to the Big Podcast Equipment Guide for 2021, early 2021, where you will learn what devices you will need to set up a podcast for up to 10 persons participating, including up to 4 remote guests dialing in. You see, ever since I started to be interested in podcasting, I was desperately looking for a guide that seemingly did not exist. One that tells me what equipment is needed if you want to set up and record a podcast that has more than one person involved. Say 2 or 3. Or what the heck, up to 8 people being present. That's fairly easy, by the way. Things get slightly more complicated, though, when you want to add the remote guest. Or 2. Or 3. Or 4. And that's when the confusion usually kicks in. And this is exactly what we will find out one by one. And by the end of it, hopefully you'll have much more clarity about what you actually need as we tick off one by one each scenario. And this is what this series is all about. In the first part, we have covered the devices that were, in my view, capable of handling the situations where one person was present and up to 4 remote guests were to dial in the most cost-effective way. Next, we will cover the scenarios where 2 persons are present, say you and a co-host, while still covering the cases if 1, 2, 3, or 4 remote guests should be interviewed on the show. To shorten the video, I have not included every bit and piece you will need for a certain setup. Instead, I have created them online with detailed info as to what and why is needed. You can find a link to that below in the description. There are many ways for an efficient podcast setup. In fact, when preparing for this video, I have listed over 150 different options. However, some simply don't make sense, like buying a Rodecaster Pro for a solo podcast. I've also followed some basic principles with my device choices to ensure good quality, reliable audio recording, and also taking care of your hard-earned cash. First, if you want good audio, get a microphone, as with them you will make a quantum leap in audio quality. You see, there's a reason why in the last 100 years every quality broadcast used a microphone. My setups will always calculate with one for each person present. Second, record everyone on a separate track, otherwise post-production editing will be a nightmare. I will only recommend setups in which this is possible. Third, prefer hardware over software, as software may and will crash. And when it crashes, it will crash right in the middle of that once-in-a-lifetime interview that you can't repeat. Other than that, looking at the subscription prices, I'm not sure it even makes a lot of sense, which leads me to number 4, avoid subscriptions when you are a beginner and you can solve it with hardware. Quality services start at $15 to $20 a month, which will reach the flipping point even when compared to investing in a hardware in about a year or 2 for most beginner podcasters. Hardware is cheaper for beginners and generally more reliable. And finally, number 5, get what you need and not what others have. Don't buy expensive stuff because top podcasters use them. Buy the ones that cover your needs instead. With that, let's get started. Let's start with a setup for a podcast recording with a co-host, where you have no remote guests invited. As in this case, both persons are present, you'll need 2 microphones. There are more than one ways to record these 2 people on separate tracks, which is the only real challenge in this situation. Let's look at our options. The most simple setup is to take a 2-in, 2-out USB audio interface. You will plug one mic into its first, the other into its second input. From here, you set channel 1 of the audio interface as the input for the first track in your recording app and channel 2 for the second track. And there you go, you are recording the 2 voices to 2 separate tracks. Note that we have already arrived at the point where my original recommendation in the first part of this video series to buy a microphone that has both USB and XLR connection has paid off. You cannot plug in a USB mic into an audio interface. Now you don't have to buy a new mic, but can use the one you had for the solo option. In theory, you can get away this time without headphones, as you are both in the same room and can hear each other, but I strongly advise against it. It is much better to monitor what is actually happening in the recording than not. The only issue is that the audio interface only has one headphone port, so if you want both of you to be able to monitor the entire recording, you need to either buy a headphone splitter or, much better and not expensive at all, a 4-way headphone-amp, which will come in handy for later setups too. This way, both of you can have your own headphones. This setup will cost you €370. The second option is the Soundcraft Notepad 8FX. It's cheap, has 2 mic inputs, and it is a 2x2 USB audio interface too, so you can record both mics on discrete tracks. It too has only one headphone port, but it's a mixer that has an aux send output, which you can use for the second headphone, coming in at $399. The third option is the warmly recommended Zoom PodTrack P4. For its versatility, portability, and features, I would recommend this device for being future-proof even if the previous two options are cheaper. You can see more details about its features in my previous video discussing the device options for 1 person's present and 1 to 4 remote guests. This setup will cost you, with the microphones and headphones, €500 plus some change. The fourth choice is the relatively freshly announced Behringer Flow 8, which is a truly capable device as we have seen at the 1 present 2 remote scenario. It can be controlled via Bluetooth using a mobile phone app, sends out 10 discrete channels via USB into your recording app, that's again 10 separate tracks, and has 2 individually configurable monitor outputs. Since in this case you can set up one of its monitor mixes for the second person's headphone, you don't even need a headphone splitter. Opting for it will result in a setup that will cost you €513. The fifth option, still borderline recommendable for this scenario, is the Allen & Heath ZI-10 multi-track USB mixer, which is a 4-in 4-out USB interface at the same time that sends out via USB and records up to 4 separate tracks in your recording app. While it also only has one headphone jack, as you are not having any remote guests this time, you can use the aux send port for the second headphone, just as with the Soundcraft Notepad 8FX, and it's relatively close in its price at €526. On to the next setup, which is 2 present plus 1 remote guest. Here we take some devices from the previous setup, but now we will have to change some of them to cater for the remote guest as well. What remain the same are the ones you see in the table right now. As we still have 2 participants that are present, we need the 2 mics and the 2 headphones. The Zoom PodTrack P4 is still more than capable of doing the job, as well as the Allen & Heath multi-track USB mixer and the Behringer Flow 8 Bluetooth-controlled digital mixer. The 2-in 2-out audio interface used in the previous setup will not be enough anymore though. As it only has 2 separate output channels, you wouldn't be able to record the 3 participants on 3 separate tracks with it, and also it won't be able to create a mix minus for the remote guests either. Here we need the Focusrite Scarlett 4i4, which, as we have seen at the 1 present 1 remote setup, will not only output 4 separate channels, but using its Focusrite control software you are able to individually select which voices go to which output, with a small limitation. As it is software-based, you will have to have some tech savviness to set it up, but it's no rocket science either, as it is explained in the Focusrite 4i4 versus 8i6 video. With that, you can easily set an output for your guest that does not include their voice. To set up the mix minus, you'll again need the iRig 2 adapter to route the phone's voice into the interface and to get the mix minus back to the phone, plus the headphone amp, so that both present participants can hear everything. Also, the Soundcraft Notepad 8FX won't be enough here, as it can only send out 2 discrete audio tracks via USB. Here, you need the Soundcraft Notepad 12FX, which has a built-in 4x4 USB audio interface, although what channel combinations it allows to be recorded separately via USB is a little selective, to put it mildly. You can record mic input 1 and 2 every time on separate channels, but after that your options are quite limited. It still works for the 2 present 1 remote setup, but that's pretty much it. And when it comes to the remote guest scenarios, this is where it ends to be recommendable. You'll need an iRig 2 adapter to connect the phone and a headphone amp to provide the co-host with a headphone. The iRig 2 is needed for the Allen & Heath and the Behringer Flow 8 multi-track recording mixer setups as well, to connect the phone and set up the remote guests. You can skip buying the headphone amp to split their single headphone outputs. The Behringer Flow 8 still has a second monitor send port free, and on the Allen & Heath, even though the aux send port is occupied by the iRig 2 for the remote guest, it also has an FX send port, which you may use to plug in the second headphone for your co-host. Looking at the costs of the setup, the Zoom P4 stayed largely the same. You just will need to buy an extra TRRS adapter cable for your phone or a USB-C cable to connect any communication device that has a USB port. The setup with the audio interface is unfortunately much higher at a cost, as if you could use the lower end 2-in 2-out interface, you'll end up paying actually €563 for it. The Allen & Heath/Behringer Flow 8 setup needs to be extended with an iRig 2 adapter, which brings up the price to €614. Last but not least, I have included a sixth option here, not because it makes more sense than the 5 others already listed, but because many of you already have the equipment that is needed for it, which is none other than the wildly popular Zoom H5. It has 2 XLR inputs at the bottom, plus it has a built-in XY microphone extension at the top. Now on the side of this extension, which Zoom likes to call capsule, there's a 3.5mm or 8-inch audio jack where you can just as well plug your mobile phone in. In this case, it will take the signal from the phone instead of the built-in XY microphone, and it is also capable of multi-track recording. I would not recommend you to buy it for this specific setup, as it will cost you €641 altogether, and since it also only has a single headphone port, you need to get an extra headphone amp as well. The second reason I won't really recommend it to you for this particular podcast setup is that setting up the mix minus for the dialing guest is really cumbersome with a lot of splitter cables and wizardry in the menu. So cumbersome that I have decided to put together a drawing of it, which you can find on the link in the description amongst the other podcast kits. Let's add a second remote guest though. This scenario, where 2 people are present and 2 remote guests are invited to dial in, may seem like similar to the previous one, and some of the equipment we used in the 2 present 1 remote setup can in fact handle the additional remote guests as well, but not all of them. Most notably, the Zoom H5 field recorder unfortunately cannot, neither can the Soundcraft Notepad series, not because they would not have enough inputs, but due to the limitations in their multi-track recording capabilities. However, the Zoom PodTrack P4, the Focusrite 4i4, the Allen & Heath ZI10 and the Behringer Flow 8 can still handle it. For the Zoom, you'll only need 1 more cable to lead in a caller from a USB device or from a phone, and therefore it costs only a few euros more than with only 1 remote guest. For the Focusrite, however, you'll need a second iRig 2 adapter and some additional cables for setting up the second mix minus, which brings up the cost to €629. Same applies to the both multi-track mixers, plus there you will need that headphone amp too. With that, the whole kit will move up to €667. As for the other options, here we are getting into the league of the big guys, but we also cannot keep it anymore below €700. First of them, and surprise surprise at a cheaper price than the others, is the Zoom LiveTrack L8. LiveTrack, not PodTrack. L and not P. This is an astonishingly capable digital mixer, as we have already seen at many scenarios in previous videos, at a fairly appealing price, especially when you compare it to what's coming in the last row. And it too has a built-in TRRS input for a mobile phone with a built-in mix minus function, so that it routes back the master mix, which is a sum of all sounds from the mixer, without the caller's voice into the phone automatically. Ingenious. You still need an iRig 2 adapter for the second remote guest though. However, this time the L8 being a digital mixer, you'll have a much easier job setting it up the mix minus, as it was explained in my podcast on the Zoom L8 video, in which I compare its podcasting features to the Mackie Onyx 8 and to the Soundcraft Signature 12 MTK. The kit with the Zoom LiveTrack L8 will come at a cost of €749. The next 2 devices, which can easily cope with the 2 present and 2 remote participants, are none other than the much beloved Rode Rodecaster Pro and the lately, in September 2020 announced, Zoom PodTrack P8. Both are designed for podcasting, and both are extremely capable and convenient devices for podcasters. Another surprise you will see though later on, that the Zoom PodTrack P8 will have already reached the end of its capacity in terms of how many remote guests it can accommodate at this mere 2, whereas with the Rodecaster Pro you could invite a third one as well. Quite a major difference, at least in my opinion. The setup will cost about the same for both of them, as both have built-in mix minus for both remote guests, so there's no need for any additional equipment. It's €783. Note that all of the devices on screen have at least one built-in mix minus, which for me is an indicator that someone has, at least for a brief moment, thought about broadcasters during the hardware design process. My clear recommendation for the two remote guest setup is, however, the Zoom P4, even if it cannot send out right away all channels through USB to your recording app, but then again neither can the PodTrack P8. Not only do I recommend it because it costs a third less for the entire setup with two mics and headphones, €520, but it also has a small size, it's portable, and then in case there's no need to invite two remote guests, it can beautifully handle the 3 present 1 remote and the 4 present 0 remote guest scenarios as well, as you will see later on at an unmatched competitive price. Let's complicate it further though by adding a third remote guest. Having 2 persons present and 3 remote guests dialing in, you will still need 2 microphones and 2 headphones. We've just discussed that the Zoom LiveTrack L8 is beautifully capable to handle 1, 2, 3 or even 4 remote guests at the same time using its TRRS phone input and the 3 different monitor mixes, mix A, B and C. However, now you will need not 1 but 2 iRig 2s. This time again, the star of the market comes to shine with its super easy and clean setup. You can also solve it with the Rode Rodecaster Pro. And not only will it be slightly cheaper this time, you will also have a very easy time to set it up, as all the mix minuses for all remote guests are built in and automatic. 2 remote guests will dial in over the phone, the first wired through a TRRS cable and the second via Bluetooth, and one via USB. The only thing you'll need to pay attention to is to switch on the USB mix minus in the menu. However, quite surprisingly, there is again the often overlooked device which actually can handle the 2 present 3 remote scenario, albeit without the convenience of the built-in mix minus. It's the Focusrite Scarlett 8i6. It is, as its name suggests, an 8-in, 6-out audio interface which has a software loopback, so you can actually route back something from the computer you have connected it to, i.e. a Skype, Zoom or a Teams call, and create as many as 4 custom output mixes. One of these custom output mixes is of course the headphone mix for the 2 persons present, for whom you have 2 headphone ports right at the front, but at the remaining 3 custom mix outputs, they can be used for the remote guests, 2 of them with the iRig 2-based setup and 1 via USB. All that for €656. Having said that, for the €125 difference, I would actually recommend to go for the Rodecaster Pro, the 2 additional mic inputs, and the sheer convenience and joy of using it, not least also for its customizable sound pads, and an all-in-all very much podcasting-focused design and build. Even the Zoom L8 cannot keep up with the overall price, which will cross the €800 mark for it in this case. I'm adding here the Soundcraft Signature 12 MTK, as it is more than capable to handle this scenario as well, and the price of this setup is not very far either, with the 2 iRig 2s and the headphone amp included. At the same time, I would not recommend it over its competitors above. With that, let's finish off the scenarios where 2 persons are present with the final option, which is 2 persons present and 4 remote guests dialing in. Now this I expect is also a very rare scenario. You'll have the 4 devices capable of handling the 4 remote guests already introduced at the 1 present 4 remote scenario. The 4 devices are the Zoom LiveTrack L8, Soundcraft Signature 12 MTK, Tascam Model 12, and the Zoom LiveTrack 12 for €903, €930, €994 and €1,082 respectively. 2 of these devices have a single built-in mix minus function for a mobile phone, and all of them require 3 iRig 2s to set up the 4 remote guests, all but the L12, which needs a 4th one. Oh, and with the Soundcraft multitrack mixer, you'll also need a headphone amp. This concludes the setups with 2 persons in the room while having up to 4 remote guests dialing in. In the next part, we'll see about the podcast setups where 3 people are present and potentially up to 4 remote guests are dialing in. And then we go on and on. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button if you have found this guide useful and to be notified when I release the next parts. With that, take care and see you next at the podcast setups guide with 3 people present and up to 4 remote guests dialing in.